This week is a fish week. If you are looking to double up on fish, then head on over to the episode I did on fish sauce with Brandon and Matt on the podcast Unchefed. I'm not so serious, and you get to hear other people too. Links to the show will be in the notes. Also fish-related, at least sometimes, Gumbo. I'll be talking about its origins and the modern compromises that have created the 21st century version at the Intelligent Speech Conference on June 25th. I'm joined by a whole bunch of other educational podcasters talking about a whole bunch of other things, not just food. I'm personally curious about the exploding New Jersey topic. Tickets are now $30, but if you use the code FOOD, you do get 10% off. Go check out the shiny new website at intelligentspeechconference.com, and the link is in the show description. Episode 47. Fish for Everybody. For now. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at this short slice of time when all the colonists in America, well, pre-America still, ate fish. They didn't so much in the 17th century, and then fish stopped being an everybody food by the end of the 18th century. I'll also be speculating about how differently the early 18th century fish eater experienced them. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that the tender, gently cooked, mild-tasting fish we experience here in the 21st century has no relation, or almost no relation, to the fish experience of the 18th century. The flavors then were strong, the fish flesh itself was very thoroughly cooked, and just what an 18th century diner was expecting when faced with a fish dish seems to be almost unrecognizable when compared to what we expect from American-style cooked fish today. Fish became a popular and common food in the early 18th century, in part because there was an embarrassment of fish available to these colonists. Before they showed up, the indigenous locals had a rich fish larder, fresh and saltwater. So many, in fact, that 17th and 18th century European reports despaired of describing the variety in abundance. The plenty of fish was not just a product of lower population density, for in the 16th and even 17th century, a surprising number of locales in North America had population densities that rivaled much of contemporary Europe, based on the numbers of pre-Columbian artifacts, expansive cemeteries, and complex earthworks still being found in North America from basically the permafrost zone to the south. Fishy abundance was instead made possible through conscious management of the fish supply, a combination of ecosystem husbandry, recognition of the need to leave adequate population for breeding and resupply, and a pretty serious understanding of the dangerous folly of waste were all part of the plan. This meant that during the early part of the 18th century, before widespread pollution of waterways through settlement and sawmill waste to the British colonists, the fish population was frankly astounding. Phrases such as, quote, "You could walk across the ocean back to England, so thick are the cod in this bay," were written back to England. Salmon the size of children were pulled out of East Coast streams. Sturgeon was a food for every man who had the strength to catch one of those sluggish dinosaur fish, not just some noble with private fishing streams and ponds. Seasonal runs of anadromous fish, the ones that return to freshwater to breed, like shad, smelt, salmon, and lampreys, were bounties beyond the capacity of any settlement to consume, and so also importantly fed the forest soil and kept that ecosystem healthy, diverse, and resilient. To the colonists' detriment, they, like their descendants, took this abundance for granted and did not husband it carefully. These days, when we think of cooked American fish, it is generally gently, barely cooked and served with a fairly light sauce or a fresh fruit or vegetable topping, like a salsa, or is battered and fried and served with a fairly pungent sauce. ketchup, tartar sauce, malt vinegar, or the like. But all of them are gently, barely, or even undercooked. The fish is expected to be soft, moist, and flaky. One of the first things that jumped out at me when I started reading old cookbooks, once I got over confusing the long S with the letter F and stopped snickering like a 12-year-old at recipes that called for, quote, a pair of sucking rabbits. Work it out in your head. I want this to be a pod for all. Anyway, the one thing that really jumped out at me was the long cooking times for the fishes. Solidness or firmness of the flesh after cooking was the desired texture rather than soft. Fish were usually cooked a long time with one method, usually boiling or broiling, or cooked using at least two methods, usually parboiling and then the other thing. Most of the 18th century cookbooks I have looked at were for pretty wealthy households. This is mainly because this is just how books worked in the 18th century. Simply that the people who could read or afford to purchase books were pretty wealthy. Remember, at this point, all the books were printed on rag paper, which was made from old discarded linen and cotton clothing. And as I've mentioned, there just wasn't that much linen and cotton clothing in the colonies, and it was rarely discarded. So until 1802, all the paper was imported, as were most of the books. Wood-based paper didn't even come to the colonies until 1858, and the manufacturer had to basically trick customers into using it. While woody plant fibers had been used in paper in Asia and North Africa, only recycled cloth fiber paper existed in Europe. It wasn't until somewhere in the second quarter of the 19th century that some Germans began experimenting with wood fiber to augment and then replace cloth-based papers. This will become important in the late 19th century when the cardboard box is created. Anyway, if you had a printed cookbook for most of the 18th century, or even wrote down your own manuscript one, you are a pretty wealthy person, all things considered. Which meant the household using cookbooks at least had servants or slaves to help out with the cooking tasks and might even employ a full-time servant or have an indentured or enslaved cook. As a result, such households typically engaged in multi-step cooking. They had several pots and pans and might have a brazier for tableside sauce work as well as using many ingredients, including a host of pricey ones such as mace, nutmeg, pepper, and lemon peel. To illustrate my point, it's time for me to describe some fish dishes. Salmon recipes were very popular. Amelia Simmons, that first American cookbook author, even called it, quote, the noblest and richest fish, unquote. Though her advice regarding letting it keep 3 or 4 days out of water before consuming it to improve the flavor is a little head-scratchy, especially where she admonishes the reader to defend said fish from the moon, which was purportedly more damaging to the salmon than the sun. Salmon were generally taken in freshwater, so when they were returning to spawn, which meant they would be at their fattiest. While they might be boiled in a mixture of wine, vinegar, and herbs, termed court bouillon or court bouillon, and served simply with a butter sauce, it was just as common to see them opened, well seasoned with salt, cayenne, and pepper, and then stuffed with a forcemeat mixture of salt pork, breadcrumbs, egg, several herbs like thyme, savory, and parsley, and then baked for more than an hour. And finally, served with a highly flavored sauce composed of wine, egg yolks, herbs, and butter. Other large fish were commonly treated similarly. The more solid meat of the sturgeon was often subjected to parboiling, roasting, and hashing. It could also be roasted in the same fashion as beef or pork, cooking it through, and then roasting it further with a butter, breadcrumb, and herb crust for an extra crispy, deeply flavored outside. Large fish were also stuffed, rolled, and collared as with other meats, especially lampreys and eels, their shape practically inviting this treatment. Pike, with their sharp teeth and long shape, seemed to be irresistible as a table showpiece. Stuffing them with a mixture of shrimps and oyster, and then arranging them in a circle for roasting was a favorite. This fish would then be served with an anchovy butter sauce, augmented with any liquor that may have come from the fish during roasting. Then there was chowder, which at this time was spelled Chouder, and it was well known in the 18th century. The U in the spelling betrayed its French origin, chaud being the French word for hot. It was definitely a fish dish. Clams won't come into play until later. At this point, it was made as a layered dish that had water poured over it and then was stewed slowly at the back of the fire. Some recipes advise a layer of onion at the bottom to prevent scorching, while those that start with the salt pork slices admonish the cook to hang the kettle high above the fire to avoid scorched salt pork. An interesting history hiccup is afoot with the chowder recipes. 18th century instructions alternately call for ship's biscuit or crackers, showing that the split from British nomenclature was well on its way. Biscuit is more commonly used in southern recipes, Maryland and South, while New Jersey and Pennsylvania, North, tend to have the word cracker. And all of the cracker-containing recipes completely put the lie to an early 19th century marketing claim that some New England dude invented the food word cracker based on the sound they made while cooking. Anyway, 18th century chowder was repeated layers of salt pork, fish fillets or chunks, onions, and cracker. It would be covered over with water, and it might get a paste lid like a pot pie. It might also have an iron lid or be left open. Regardless, it would be left to stew for hours at the back of the fire. When done, it would be served as a sort of juicy pie or very thick stew, and usually covered with a sauce, often with a highly seasoned, thickened wine sauce. Dairy and potatoes were not yet part of the chowder. Potatoes will start to creep in at the end of the century, and cream will come in the 19th. Smaller fish were often cooked as a fricassee. There were two popular versions: a white fricassee, where the fish would be parboiled in water, or a fish broth, or some combination of either of those with wine. Then they would be cooked as a white sauce was formed around them with flour, butter, spices, and cream. Or a brown fricassee, where the parboiled fish or fish pieces would be dusted in flour and then fried crispy brown in shallow fat as the fish were shaken and turned. Fish were also braised, roasted, stewed, and baked, with a firm fish the desired result, which would be re-moistened with a strongly flavored sauce, often accompanied by meatballs, usually of pork fat and fish or veal, and some vigorous seasoning that usually included pepper or cayenne, mace, and herbs like thyme and savory. If you weren't so rich as to have wine on hand for cooking, a frying pan, an indoor oven, a gridiron, a hoe plate, and a brazier, but were the type of person who cooked on an open fire with a kettle, you might use a more modest, plainer collection of recipes. So for the rest of the colonists, this meant smoked, planked, and fried fish, though chowder would have been a crossover dish, as it was made of modest, commonly found ingredients when you leave out the fancy spices and wine sauces. It, after all, was a one-pot meal and would see to itself as it cooked away all day. Smoked fish were usually cleaned small fish suspended in the back of the fireplace or in a nook of the chimney and well smoked. The other preparations, planked and fried, would often be used cold as part of breakfast since they needed little or no further preparation to be eaten. Planking the fish simply meant tying the fish to a board and propping it up next to the fire. The simplest method was just a whole, cleaned, small fish, though it could also be split open, which is usually what happened if the fish was a bit larger. That and setting a fish on coals, either plain or wrapped in leaves, thus imitating methods for cooking corn cakes and bannocks and the like. Fried small fish like smelts, roach, perch, and similar were shallow fried in drippings, either with a dusting of flour or just plain. These simpler breakfast-type fish would likely have been more to the taste of the modern fish consumer rather than the thoroughly cooked, maybe overcooked, and then heavily dressed and sauced fish of the fancier tables. The breakfast-type fish consumed by the 18th century colonist was a departure from how the typical British person experienced fish. The fancy recipes for the well-to-do were very similar, but for the little people, having access to quite fresh, small fresh and saltwater fish back in England had been pretty uncommon. Fishing and overfishing were very common back on the home island at this point. This is why the Dutch were importing eels, most of the Atlantic salmon were being consumed only by rich people in London or by those with extensive Scottish or Irish estates, and the importing of dried and salted cod was a profitable venture. The setting up of fixed nets almost entirely blocking off salmon attempting to return to their spawning grounds, and the very polluted rivers of southern England with both human and industrial waste had really done in much of the domestic fish supply. And a majority of the fish that came to the common people was oversalted or burnt, or was undersalted or undersmoked and putrid. So fish as a food was not favored outside of wealthy circles, and amongst those in fishing villages who ate fish at a subsistence level, which also meant few of the 17th century colonists had the first clue of how to catch, clean, or cook a fish. I cannot remind you too often that one way the Pilgrims had planned to pay for the setup costs of their venture had been by setting up a fishing venture, but they brought with them neither fishing tackle nor fishing knowledge. So based on their culinary experience and overall lack of contact with fresh fish and fishing, it makes sense why the earliest colonists had so little interest in consuming fish. However, after watching so many of their recent ancestors come close to starving or actually succumbing, the 18th century colonists were ready to try more things, including fish. The salted, pickled, and smoked and potted recipes of the 17th century still existed and were used, but the fact that there was plenty of fish, pretty much year-round, and was somewhere between cheap and free, because just about everyone lived next to or near a fish-bearing body of water, meant that preserved fish fell out of favor and off the regular menu. Overall, more careful and skill-requiring methods of fish preservation were largely lost. Examples of the varieties of fish tech that were lost to most of the 18th century North American colonists include the following: the lye and basic type preservation, like lutefisk, matjas and other fish products that depend on salt and pancreatic or other digestive enzyme for their decomposition and aging, pickled fish, both vinegar and lactobacillus-generated lactic acid varieties also waned in popularity. Even smoking became less common during the century, especially that hard smoking for long preservation rather than flavor. And many of the dishes that made use of parts other than the fillets started to go by the wayside. There was one fish that continued to be used tip to tail, though, and that was cod, sort of a pig of the sea. The main market for the fillets of the fish was the salt cod market, whether salted and wind-dried or barreled. The practice was so common, even to this day, that there are parts of the world that only know cod in its salted form, and they don't really have words for or don't recognize the fish in its fresh incarnation. So the tech for wind drying and hard salting remained, but because it mainly went as exports, recipes for its use in the colonies were limited. Selling what is generally known as salt cod abroad, the high-quality stuff to Europe, especially Catholic Spain, France, and Italy, and the low-quality stuff to the sugar, coffee, indigo, spice, and other plantations in the Caribbean, built what came to be called the codfish aristocracy in Boston. While many a wealthy New Englander would claim they didn't own slaves or participate in the slave trade directly, quite a few of them profited from selling them food. In fact, without the Boston salt cod trade, the 18th century sugar industry in the Caribbean could not have existed as it did. By having a food source that was shelf-stable in a humid tropical climate that met the caloric and salt needs of the enslaved workers, well, more or less, and realistically less, the intensive monocropping economy that was importing all its food was made possible. If the islands had been required to feed themselves with local food, the story of sugar on those islands would have been different. How exactly, I haven't stopped to consider too deeply, but the explosive growth of the sugar industry as it went would not have been possible. So the question that comes up, with all the fish meat, tons and tons and tons and tons of it being salted and exported, what happened to the rest of the fish? the fish industrial waste, if you will. Well, the heads were sold locally. They were roasted, stewed, and were a popular meat source for the chowders. Considering that the cod caught at this time were often 20 pounds and up, a cod head made for a substantial meal. As for the innards, the most popular in English cuisine was the swim bladder or the sound, which of course leads to recipe books giving a diagram of a proposed dinner table that includes the rather conceptual art sounding item, a dish of cod sounds. When coming upon that one out of context, more than one person has asked just what sounds do cods make and why are you serving them in a dish? Well, now you know the answer to that question. The livers were also recognized as valuable, as oil was needed in many applications, even outside of food. There are many ways to prepare a cod liver. In Nordic countries and Russia, it was common to suspend the livers over boiling water and let the oil melt out. Then that oil would be used in lamps, as liniments, that's a medicinal skin rub, as well as a food source, often accompanied by the steam-cooked liver. In parts of Asia where fermenting fish was still common, the livers would be salted and fermented to extract the oil. But in colonial North America, where cod was a business more than anything else, the livers were collected in barrels where they would simply rot. The oil would collect on top of the putrid mixture, creating a product unfit for human consumption. It would be used in the developing iron machinery of the colonies and in things like leather tanning. Human consumption of cod liver oil will return in the 19th century, and figuring out how to make it possible will be a whole series of conundrums and lead to more food tech. But cod wasn't the only fish of the 18th century used in ways far different than the rest of the fish. The other one was the anchovy. In British cuisine, which was still the main focus of what was being eaten in the British colonies, the anchovy was not so much a fish as it was a seasoning. While cod was imported into Europe from North America, the anchovy, salted and barreled, was exported. Anchovies were purchased and used to make ketchups, sauces, and even dressings for vegetables. An anchovy melted in butter would be a common sauce, especially for other seafood dishes. Anchovies melted into wine and egg yolk sauces would give them an extra saltiness and roundness. Anchovy ketchup, a brewed and aged liquid of anchovies, vinegar, and spices, effectively Worcestershire sauce, was extremely popular. And as a point of order, I must focus in on a particular sauce for cooked vegetables or cold chicken and other meats. And this popular 18th century sauce was, quote, made with lemon peel, oil, vinegar, capers, caviar, and anchovies mixed very well. In other words, my friends, the concept of a lemon, egg proteins, salt, and anchovies sauce was a quite well-known idea in 17th and 18th century British and European cookery. We are always told that the Caesar salad was invented in Tijuana, Mexico during Prohibition, because all the fancy California restaurants decamped to Tijuana so they could still serve cocktails and wine. But that flavor combination of the umami from the anchovy, the sour from the lemon, the binding agent and richness of the egg, and the oil and salt, this was well known in European cooking circles, and Mr. Caesar Cardini was Italian. And Mexico, from its invasion by the Spanish religious and governmental institutions, has had a strong European cuisine tradition since at least the 16th century. The audacity of putting it on raw lettuce instead of on a cooked item, now that was revolutionary. But my cookbooks show me that the flavor combination was familiar and well known. And while modern Caesar dressings often feature garlic, mine sure does, the original did not, which fits with the garlic suspicious style of the 1920s American tastes and 1700s British cookery. So the 18th century was still extremely fond of strong flavors when they could get them. Vinegar, cayenne, and highly seasoned ketchups, even on their fish. The blandness and plainness that will come to be associated with American fish dishes has yet to happen. The drawn butter sauces, the white sauces, and the tentative sprinkle of Old Bay seasoning. Cod was still king of the fish in quantity, but salmon seems to have been the favorite then as now for flavor and luxury. Next week, we return to fish's partner in history, salt. America has figured out how to stop importing so much salt from afar. We aren't yet an exporter, but the salt for the fish industry and beyond is starting to be mostly made on the home shores. To see how that works and how it starts to add to the woes of the bean counters in London, who are seeing the expected profits from exports continue to slip away, join me next week and learn how the colonies got salty. Thanks for listening. A quick reminder for Intelligent Speech, come and learn what the most international food in the world is, or at least what my panel members each think it is. Tickets are at intelligentspeechconference.com, link in the show notes, and there is a 10% discount off the ticket price of $30 if you use my code FOOD. Thank you to those of you who have been thoughtful enough to leave me a review, but I could always use more to help get the word out to more people. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email, questions, or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter and Instagram bio at THOA Food and in the show description.